So let me do the very, very brief summation and recap for those who are completely new to the controversy. Essentially, Amazon is doing Rings of Power, which will be taking stories from the appendices of Lord of the Rings, but of course, stretching things out, and that's what the series will be based on. And they've made more than a few controversial decisions. Some of them I don't think are particularly controversial, and some I do. And in particular, some of what the cast is saying has rung a few alarm bells. And I've tried to be careful and patient, but probably one of the biggest dilemmas is Lenny Henry and what he has to say about the role of hobbits in the story, because again, the appendices are basically about the Second Age, and there's very, very little on the hobbits. Some would contend there's nothing at all. Still a bit of a controversy there too. So I'm going to try to let him speak for himself.
And what's notable about this is that about this run of the book, it's a prequel to the age that we've seen in the films and the books. It's about the early days of the Shire and of of Tolkien's environment. It's the early days of it. So we're an indigenous population of Harfoots, and we're hobbits, but we're called Harfoots, and we're multicultural. We're a tribe. We're not a race. So there are black and Asian and brown and even Maori types within it. And it's a whole brand new set of adventures that see some of the origins of different characters. And it's going to take at least 10 years to tell the story.
Best case, worst case scenario about what all this means. Well, the best case is he's just a complete and utter idiot and moron and has no clue whatsoever as to what Tolkien wrote, what he meant, and his construction of what Tolkien was up to is just beyond crazy and stupid. And luckily, he's not a producer, he's not writing the show, he's not a director. So it's just a performer who really doesn't understand Tolkien and is just trying to advertise the show, but doesn't quite know what the hell he's talking about. And that's it. But worst case scenario is he is providing substantive clues about the storylines and about what the hobbits will be doing and what they're up to in this world. But even there, I am beyond confused because none of these statements are coherent together, and they don't even really cohere separately either, so it's really hard to make sense of what he's saying. So he's saying that the Harfoots are not a race. Well, again, what race is in Tolkien is kind of difficult, but it does seem legitimate to call them breeds of hobbits, and as far as I know, there are three. The Harfoots are dominant. Having them in the story seems legitimate. A lot of people think there can't be hobbits in the Second Age. Well, the story's not focused on them in terms of the Silmarillion, but they do exist. But he also mentions the Shire. Now, the Shire pretty clearly does not exist, at least not in the Second Age, so it seems a little puzzling he's bringing in the Shire. Is he talking about the prehistory of the Shire? That would still be off by quite a huge amount of time. It's a little weird, it's unclear. He also says the hobbits are going to seed the new characters. What does that mean? Does he mean that the first episode is basically going to give us the hobbits and what the hobbits do, perhaps transform the world in a way that initiates what will happen to the new characters? From what I understand, the hobbits are just side characters. They're not even really involved with the central story, which is about Sauron forging the rings and trying early on to corrupt people, and how the rings are actually created. The hobbits really don't play much of a role in that. What does he mean by that? What new characters? Does he mean the Hobbit characters? Does he mean other characters? Which characters? And then in the other statements, he goes on about the politics and what he thinks is good about quote, black people and people of color being in fantasy. Again, technically not relevant. But then he says the hobbits are not really the hobbits, and the Harfoots are not the way the hobbits are traditionally depicted, and I have no clue what he means by that. He says we're really not the hobbits, but they're the Tolkien little guy, and we're there for comedy relief, which may be his interpretation of what the hobbits are, and I'm sure that's even a popular interpretation. I'm sure that may be even the dominant interpretation among a lot of fans who really do think the hobbits are, just these cute little creatures, and they're happy and fun and frolic, and nothing bad happens to them. They have no range of emotions, and they never feel sadness or pain or anxiety. That's not what the texts say. Even some of the adaptations get this correct that, no, the hobbits do have a range of emotion. They're not just there for comedy. No idea what he's talking about there either. All put together, it's kind of a nightmare if they are going to be playing around with the Hobbit mythology. And here's where I do actual research and a lot of other people do not, because very recently we now know that they do have the rights to the Hobbit. that Amazon has purchased MGM, and through MGM, they've acquired the rights to The Hobbit. And apparently all the rights to The Hobbit, not just the book, but the theme parks, to entertainment outlets, to basically any Hobbit-oriented material, they have ownership of that. You can look at it two ways. This really isn't going to affect the main story of Rings of Power in terms of Galadriel or some of the other major characters, which is probably what most people are focused on. That's a good part of it. But the bad part of it is if they have the rights to The Hobbit, then canonically they might be able to do things they weren't able to do before. So maybe Lenny Henry just was told behind the scenes that, yes, technically we're limited to the appendices, but we may get the rights to The Hobbit soon, so we'll be able to use the Hobbits. Even if it doesn't really fit the story, they can be kind of tucked in there because they're not really going through the appendices, they're going through the basically prehistory of The Hobbit, and they might legitimately put them in through that way. What does this all mean? Well, I guess if you want to look at the upside, and I've kind of suspected this from the beginning, and a lot of people have suspected it too, that they're going to have Gandalf and Gollum somehow. Could, technically, but you'd have to play with the timeline. But again, if they have ownership of The Hobbit, it could be towards the end of the series, in the final seasons, they're going to bring us Gandalf and Gollum because we're going to set up the beginning of the Hobbit story. So I don't know. I don't have any sources on that, but that might be one little trick they're going to be able to pull to get the fan favorite appearances, but do it legitimately through the legal rights on The Hobbit. Nevertheless, that still says a lot of bad things about the decision making of the executive producers, that they've hired somebody who is fairly stupid and ignorant of the Tolkien canon and has an agenda and also doesn't know very much about anything that he's speaking of. And that's going to be the representation for the Hobbits. The good side is probably the Lord of the Rings mythology, as well as the Silmarillion, and even the Second Age mythology in totality is not going to be touched or disturbed. But the downside is some of the Hobbit mythology may take a beating and be perverted and turned into something it's really not. Again, this isn't going to affect the books as far as I know, but it is going to confuse people who probably think they know what the Hobbits are, and they're going to get a very, very shallow or narrow or just very perverted focus on them that really isn't ever supposed to be in the text or was never really part of Tolkien's story. But however you cut it, this is a very ignorant person talking. They happen to be black, so that raises up difficult racial issues, which some people like European lore are taking advantage of. And we have a land of opportunity with grifters, a lot of idiots. But I think if you're sort of in the middle and not particularly on the extremes, yeah, there are warning signs, but nothing too worrisome. But yeah, Lenny Henry is probably one of the biggest alarm bells that at least part of the production is going to be skewing the mythology in very bizarre, I think, very problematic ways.